Okay, so welcome to Autism and Accessibility, Design Challenges and Solutions, this AbilityNet webinar. I'm Mark Walker. I'm the Head of Marketing and Communications from AbilityNet, and today's expert on our webinar is David Henke-Reid. Hi, David.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
We've got some slides to run through. We've got about 30 minutes of presentation, and we have about 15-20 minutes to answer questions. For those of you who want to ask questions as you go along, please do. I'm going to be briefly introducing David. David's going to be doing the majority of the talking in terms of presentation. I'll be trying to handle questions, so please just keep sending questions through. I may or may not be able to deal with them as we go along. We may hold off and do a few at the end. Depends on what we've got. But any questions that you have, use the questions box on the right-hand side of the control panel. So before we start, I'm just going to launch a poll, and I'm just going to check the software's working and also just find out a little bit more about who you are. Could you tell me, for those of you already in, which of the following best describes your role? Are you an accessibility specialist? Are you a UX specialist or similar? Do you run digital projects? Do you commission websites or apps or some other interest? I think you can tick more than one. So if you're a little bit unsure, or use the questions box to mention anything in particular as an interest for today, just so that we know that we've got got some picture of who the audience is, and that we cover things that are going to be useful to you. Great, we've got most people voted so far, and I can see that most popular is an accessibility specialist so far, and then we've got a couple of them mentioning an assessment centre manager, a disability advisor, a work in an inclusive support team in higher education. Somebody wants to know what a UX specialist is. That's a user experience specialist, somebody who designs digital projects and is involved specifically in thinking about the needs of the users in terms of the design of the website, app, or other digital service. Speech language pathologist, and librarian supporting disabled and neurodiverse students. Interactive community map of charities and organisations and want to make sure that it's accessible. So a whole range of different interests. So head of Oxford University Assessment Centre, deputy head of the university's Disability Advisory Service. So I think although we are mainly talking about digital projects, I think I can also see lots of interest there in terms of how to make any services and systems accessible in terms of the needs of people with autism. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a steer as well, David, in terms of, I'll just show you the results, the sorts of people that we're going to be talking to today, and equally, because of that wide range, please do feel free to drop questions in if you feel that we've used some jargon or there's things that you don't understand, such as that thing about saying that you don't know what UX is. Please do pull us up on that sorts of stuff.
Yes, I'll definitely bear some of that in mind. Yeah,
brilliant, thank you. So before we get going, just very briefly introduce you to AbilityNet. We are a national charity, a UK charity. We help older people and people with disabilities use technology to achieve their goals at home, at work, and in education, and on the web, and in apps and all the other digital environments that surround us. We have a digital accessibility team based in Warwick and London who do lots of accessibility support for lots of different blue chip clients. So amongst those are Lloyd's, BT, Barclays, Microsoft, amongst our recent customers. IBM and Microsoft are also our corporate partners. They're the founders of AbilityNet. We were founded 20 years ago now, celebrating our birthday this year. And so we very much sort of come from the tech side and then look at how it's applied for people with disability and sit in the middle of that, providing one-to-one assessments in the workplace, DSA assessments for students in HE. We have a network of almost 300 volunteers who can go into people's homes in the UK and provide them with tech support and get them up and running and help them use Skype to get in touch with their family and so on. Got lots of free resources, fact sheets, blog posts and other content on our website. We have something called My Computer My Way, which is a free tool on our website that tells you about all the accessibility features in all the mainstream operating systems, Android, Mac, PC. And we have a free helpline. So anytime you're stuck on anything, please do get in touch with us or pass that telephone number on to anybody you think maybe needs some help in some way in terms of adapting their technology or working out what their options are. So today we're going to be looking at autism. I'm going to hand over now to, I'm going to just find the right button to hand over to David, and I'm going to leave you in his capable hands. So here we go, David. You should get a little thing up there now. You got that? Great. Can we hear you, David?
You hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Awesome. Can you see my screen as well?
We can indeed.
Awesome, great. Let's get a start. So, hi everyone, my name's David, as Mark introduced me. I'm one of the accessibility consultants at AbilityNet. So I spend a lot of my time caring about the accessibility, so mostly of websites and apps, and my kind of special interest is autism. Now, as a very brief introduction, to get a sense of what we are talking about, I'm just going to give some kind of very definition-based approaches to autism. So the NHS would talk about autism spectrum disorder as being an umbrella term for a range of conditions that affect social interaction, communication, interest, and behaviour. Now, straight off the bat, something to kind of consider is that you may have heard of, say, Asperger's syndrome, of high-functioning autism, low-functioning autism, classical autism, and what the NHS and kind of medical professions in general are now moving towards is this umbrella term of autism spectrum disorder. So what I'm going to talk about today is this kind of umbrella term. The National Autistic Society, which is the kind of the UK charity for autism, talks about it being a lifelong developmental disability that affects how people perceive the world and interact with others. So we now have two definitions, although something that we can perhaps start to think about is that we don't necessarily get a strong sense of what autism is. We might say I've heard of it a lot, but even with these definitions, we're told, well, it affects social interaction, it affects how we perceive the world, but what exactly are we talking about? So if we get a bit more kind of granular, some kind of common symptoms we can talk about are things like social anxiety, obsessive interests, so the kind of the classic obsession with certain things, kind of ritualistic behavior, which is more colloquially known as stimming, so rocking back and forth, certain hand gestures are very common. Sensory sensitivity, for example, photophobia, so for example, a aversion to very strong lights, very garish colors, for example. In terms of statistics, we would look about 1 in 100, which is about 700,000 in people in the UK. Something that in the US, the Centre for Disease Control are observing is a really growing rate in childhood diagnosis. So in about the year 2000, about 1 in 150 children being diagnosed, and that's now up to 1 in 68. So you may very often come across the 1 in 100 statistic. However, that does seem to be something that is going to become 1 in a lot lower than 100. It is presently diagnosed much more commonly in young boys than in girls. That is quite a controversial point, but just to say, as the medical world is looking at autism currently, it is something that is more commonly diagnosed in boys.
David, can I just jump in here with a
Yes,
poll? I'm interested to see how familiar people are with ASD, and so I'm just sent a poll up.
Yes, of course.
If you're able to just tell me, because obviously you skipped over some stuff there, and my take on the people who are here is that they'll know most of that, but I just didn't want to miss anything, some of the assumptions. So 77% of people are saying they're familiar with it. 20% sort of, I'd like to know more. So if you have questions about that, because we're obviously going to move on now a bit beyond the point of what autism is, but if there's questions that you have, then please do drop them into the question box as we go along. And as I said, we'll try to avoid too much jargon. But just to show you very briefly, 77% of people have said they're familiar with it. So we are.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That people will have some understanding of what we're talking about.
Great.
Great.
Okay, so the thing that I often have to think about is why autism needs considering. So what I think people will often get in their heads when thinking about, say, websites, access to digital services, is that autism isn't something that really comes on people's agendas very often. It's very often say, oh, well, say in terms of vision impairment, you can get this very kind of easy use case of, well, can I see the screen, or can my screen reader interact with the screen? And it's more of a nuanced experience and discussion when talking about autism. And the very important thing for me is how the web has changed. It's no longer just text on a page, it is incredibly social. So for example, the biggest websites right now are Facebook. They are very sensory, for example, with YouTube. Some of the most popular uses of the internet are things like gaming. So things like PUBG, Players Unknown Battlegrounds, for example, is a very popular video game at the moment with tens of millions of players, and it is incredibly social use of the internet. And if we're talking about a disorder which fundamentally affects one's social parameters, then that's something that needs considering in terms of accessibility. Similar with, say, things like YouTube and Facebook, the web is becoming something where autism needs to be talked about, thought about. And that's hopefully what we're going to do today. Another example is how communications with technology are becoming much more expression-based. So an example would be animojis with the recent, say, iPhone X release. If, for example, with autism, we talk about things like facial agnosia. So, for example, a struggle at interpreting facial expressions, then again, it's needing to have a conversation about autism. So what are some things we can talk about today? So some, as I've already talked about, is websites that present sensory information. So for example, if I'm on Facebook and we have auto-playing videos, well, we can talk about that as potentially being a problem for people with autism who, say, are perhaps quite sensitive to sensory information. So we can say, as an accessibility concern, can we consider not auto-playing videos? Another example, this is from a friend of mine who said had a stimming behavior, and her kind of stimming behavior, so again, it's kind of a repetitive physical action, was to shake her hands back and forth. The problem was she had an Android phone that if you shook it, it would toggle the flashlight on and off. And so we can point at that, we can say, well, that's an accessibility issue within the context of autism. If your experience of autism involves stimming, shaking your hands, and your phone has a feature that essentially makes you into a beacon of light whenever you do this, so we can talk about that. So for a bit more context, what I do in my day-to-day is accessibility testing. So I'll look at websites, and something I'll use is the WCAG, and this is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now these are essentially a series of checkpoints which we can use to assess a website's accessibility. Things that we can think about with autism specifically would involve things like audio control. So for example, does a website automatically play audio? Because if it does, we can talk about that as being a problem. Again, if we consider the kind of sensory sensitivity of autism, we can raise a failure and say, hey, this is a problem. That is something that, say, also comes up with screen reader users. So for example, if I'm using a screen reader, I'm experiencing a website through audio and audio automatically plays. That's a problem. Other examples are things like pause, stop, and hide. Now that's essentially, you can think of that as the carousel success criteria. So again, if there's automatically moving information on a website, so for example, a carousel that you can't pause or stop, we could raise a failure at AbilityNet. We could say, we've tested this website and you have sensory information that I can't control. Similar with on input. On input is the success criteria, which I say, I've inputted, so I've clicked on something, I've hit the spacebar, and something really unexpected happens. And again, with autism, we can say, well, that shouldn't happen. The website should be very predictable. Another two are consistent navigation identification. So with those two, we would say things like, I would expect the website to be organized and structured and logical. And in as much as we've talked about autism as containing, say, quite ritualistic interests or very black and white thinking, things like that, there are ways in which we can use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to expand the scope of it to talk about autism. However, there are some checks that aren't really covered. So the WCAG has 3 levels, A, AA, and AAA. And unfortunately, some of the things that are important to autism are only captured in AAA. So for example, reading level. One thing we often talk about with autism is things like the use of metaphors, the use of sarcasm, the use of, say, poetic language that may or may not be understood by someone with autism who has more literal thinking. However, that isn't something that's commonly tested because AAA is a very, very difficult level to achieve, and it's a very difficult level to test for. So people just often don't test for it. Similarly, there are some things that I would say are important that aren't captured by any guidelines out there. One example being gentler colors. So again, if we're talking about sensory sensitivity, one thing would be saying on your website, you should perhaps consider having an accessible color palette. Now, this actually comes from physical spaces. So there is some kind of architects that are very interested in accessibility, and they've generated a series of colors that they think are very amenable for autism-friendly spaces. But again, this stuff can be applied to the web, but it's lacking any guidelines of being able to say, hey, we think you should use these. So, Mark, this might be a good point for questions because I'm about to jump on to some more conversations about the future. So I'm wondering whether or not there are any questions about things that we can do about accessibility and autism today.
Thanks, David. And I think the other thing that I noticed in here is just how familiar people might be with WCAG and the fact that websites can be tested. So if there's things in here that you're not familiar with, do let us know. This is the bread and butter of the work that David does and that we do in AbilityNet. But this can appear quite technical, I think. And so if you have any questions about this, do let us know. Or if it looks familiar, then that's great. We'll just continue. I think the thing that I picked up by sort of following through there, David, is that when people are creating, you said it very clearly, that when people are creating websites and apps, they may not be thinking about autism as being an accessibility issue. Very common for people to talk to us about visual impairment, for example, and all the issues that somebody may have if they're using a screen reader. But of course, that's quite a significant set of issues that may be thrown up here that need to be checked through, but they actually all appear within the guidelines. It's just a case of applying them to this particular.
Absolutely, it's getting a sense of that. So in as much so with things like screen readers, it's very black and white. You can download an open source screen reader such as NVDA, for example, and you can test your website. And the important thing there is this idea of like, well, can someone technically access this information? With autism, the conversation becomes slightly more nuanced because instead of saying, well, can the person literally sit at a computer desk? Can they literally open their web browser, type in his web address and hit the URL and then scroll through the page? Because the answer there 9 times out is yes. And whenever we talk about accessibility, the baseline of technically it's accessible is often the case of, well, yes, they can technically do this. The issue being that it gets a bit more nuanced and saying, well, yes, but can the user then understand this? And is it an amenable experience? Is it an enjoyable experience? Is it an experience that doesn't make them feel uncomfortable? So, for example, so language is an interesting one for me, where, for example, if there's just some text on the page that is screen reader accessible, we'd say, okay, that's that, check passed. But if they're using language that is, say, very non-literal, so it uses lots of strange turns of phrase, for example, we would then say, it's then saying, well, the person with autism can literally read that, but can we ensure that that user has a full sense of understanding that content? So it becomes slightly different, I think. And I think that's where a lot of the time we end up perhaps not fully considering this.
Cool. And I've got a question that links to that. Is how can you gather feedback meaningfully if people may not express themselves verbally or in different ways? Is it an observation? Or what sort of techniques are you using to make sure that you're considering some of those more nuanced questions you mentioned there?
That is a very good question. So in terms of things, so obviously use testing is massively important for me. And there are some things I'd say that's somewhat tangential, but ensuring that any kind of user groups you do, any kind of user testing you do, and any feedback you elicit is done in a way that is itself accessible. So, for example, if you're trying to get this feedback, ensuring it's written in such a way that where you're being direct, you're being to the point. You say, if you're inviting people to your space, ensuring that it is autism friendly. So, for example, having a quiet room, saying, look, there will be if you get freaked out, there is a space where you can go to where you can be by yourself and be quiet. It's things like saying, tell me anything that you feel makes you uncomfortable with this, not just asking, do you understand this, but saying, is there anything about it that you find off-putting, and things like that. And as said, it's also being somewhat literate in things like alternative forms of communication. So ACC, for example, of which there's loads and loads of different variants. There's things like iPad apps you can use to communicate with someone that perhaps is non-verbal. Even if it's as simple as a bunch of kind of faces, one from a very frowny face, one to a very happy face, and you can just ask, okay, well, how does this page make you feel? It's little things like that, really, and having a literacy of those forms of communication that are popular in the autism community.
Cool. Thank you. I'm just going to, one other point made here, there was a question about what WCAG is. It's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We jump over that because it is part of the accessibility benchmark, if you like, on a global basis, is these guidelines that have been produced. If you look up WCAG, WCAG, online and go to the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, there's loads of guidelines there. They're the sort of bread and butter of an accessibility consultant. They don't talk about disabilities and conditions such as autism directly. They talk about the access requirements and the technology, for example, being able to use audio controls that you can then check against. So if you, we will share some notes afterwards. We'll make sure that there's a link within the notes that get sent around to make it clear where we're referring to. There's an interesting question just about the palette we have up on the screen at the moment, is how do you balance out the need for pastel colors with the need for sufficient color contrast? Do you ever come across problems where that you've got one problem throwing up another problem?
Ooh, that is also a very good question. I'm impressed at the level of these questions. So the thing I would say with these kind of color palettes is, so there's a few things. One, in terms of, so this is based on more so physical spaces where things like contrast aren't as important. But there's a very interesting point in that, in as much as colors that contrast very well are inherently colors that are perhaps going to be quite garish or quite striking, in as much as if you go, say, from one extreme color to one other extreme color, that can be quite a powerful color that might, say, be quite difficult for someone to consume. The thing I would say with that is picking and choosing things. So the problem isn't so much with having one or two kind of powerful colors. It's more so when, so the kind of term here we would talk about, say, sensory overload, and it's more when the kind of really, really super contrasting colors are everywhere. If, for example, you have some very important information that contrasts loads, then I would say that was fine. But it's ensuring that otherwise there's kind of the general background use of colors is more, again, it's called more pastel colors. So again, it's thinking about what is decoration and what is informative. And the thing I would say is that try to go with the kind of general blended pastel colors for decorative background information that isn't actually communicating anything important. So similar to the physical spaces where they're just walls, they're not actually telling you anything. And then having more powerful colors for the information that is actually important, saying, this is what I need to tell you. Because otherwise, if everything is contrasting, it's the problem of not being able to kind of pick out what is important, because there's just all these colors everywhere, if you see what I mean.
Okay, and I mean, as you say, very often with any of the testing, there's going to be a balance between some of the contradictions between requirements.
Absolutely, and it's picking and choosing the battles.
Getting that right as you become more familiar with it as well, I think, isn't it? Cool. So let's crack on then. Do you want to move on to the next slide? There are some questions coming in which I'm going to keep managing, but we'll probably come back to those more generally at the end.
Okay, so that's kind of some thoughts about where we are today and the kind of accessibility testing we can do using some guidelines. But I also want to talk about what's kind of coming up on the horizon, so more kind of autism tomorrow. I'm going to kind of talk about 2 areas of impairment and relevant technologies. And I'm going to talk about some of the strengths, weaknesses, and design considerations. The 2 I'm going to talk about, I'll say, anxiety therapy, and something called the Blue Room, and also emotion agnosia through something called Seeing AI. So the first one is the Blue Room, which is a kind of cave environment, an augmented reality environment developed by Newcastle University and the NHS. And this is for mostly children with autism who say will often have social fears and social phobias, but struggle with traditional therapies. So for example, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, often kind of relies on imagination and internalizing a lot of stuff and certain kind of thought patterns, which may or may not be amenable to kids with autism. And so the solution here that's being investigated is using this kind of augmented reality environment, where they can kind of have a play experience of reality. So they kind of use an iPad to move around a virtual world to kind of come across situations that they might normally find to be quite stressful or quite kind of anxiety producing due to some kind of social impairment. Now, as I said, that's very powerful. The research of it so far seems to be that it can be very, very effective, but to kind of consider another side of it, I want to talk briefly about the autism and the simulation. So there's a thing called the Uncanny Valley, which talks about how when representations of humans become more realistic, they can become scary. So for example, if we start with a stick figure, that's fine, that's non-threatening, it's not at all real, it's fine. We say move along with Disney cartoons where things become more real, they look more realistic. So for the example here is The Incredibles, where things start to look more like a real human being, but it's not scary, it's still enjoyable, it's still fun, it's not threatening. But then there's this valley we fall into where things become too real, and the representations of human beings, say, for example, through computer graphics or through robots, suddenly start to become weird and a bit scary because they're obviously not human, but they look human enough that it's strange. And then you get out of this valley when you talk about real human beings. Now, the reason I bring this up to do with autism is that you may or may not have come across news stories to do with social robots. So one here is a seal robot that's currently being developed more so for people in care and nursing homes, but there's also a lot of research going on in terms of whether or not companion robot animals can help people with autism. And the reason I bring this up in the context of the Blue Room is to say that people with autism often have a problem with real human beings. And if you're designing something or thinking about something that involves communicating with real human beings, then this uncanny valley can be really important in as much as real human beings are perhaps scary. And if you're trying to interact with technology, it might actually be to get away from talking to real human beings. So that's why, say, if you're thinking about, say, having something such as the room to help people, it's making some design considerations about what can be amenable for autism. So, for example, the example here is the non-humanoid companion animal robot, the seal, perhaps being much more of a nicer experience than having a strange CGI human friend. So the second technology was Seeing AI. Now this is a kind of glasses you'll wear, so similar to, say, Google Glass, which can look at your surroundings and it can feed back information. And a very important one that is key for autism is emotion recognition. So for example, informed by machine learning, you can look at someone and it would be able to say, oh, hey, this is what I think their facial expression is. This is who I think they are, and this is how I think they're feeling. Now, if you have autism and you have this kind of emotion agnosia, where you struggle to read someone's facial expressions, this technology can help you. It can say, hey, I think you might struggle with this, and I'm going to give you a helping hand. So that sounds really good. So what's potentially a problem with it? Well, a big one, and this is an unfortunate thing, that isn't a nice thing to talk about, but people with autism or ASD are about 6 times more likely to show self-injury. So for example, head banging, shaking one's heads back and forth, hitting oneself. Now, if you're going to say, if you're looking into, say, technologies that can help people with autism, and this involves some kind of technology, something that people have to wear, you need to factor in that this is a condition that might involve self-injury. So, for example, if I'm going to be wearing Seeing AI to help me recognize people's emotions, then they're going to need to be glasses that can take a punch, basically. Now, there's one more bit. Oh, yeah, of course.
David, can we just jump in there? I think only because you jumped over Seeing AI, and I think it's a hugely interesting area, and we talk about this particular app quite a lot, and it happens to be there are other apps that do this. This happens to be a particular sort of Microsoft tool that we've been introduced to through Microsoft as well. So I just wanted to explain to people a bit more about what this is. This is an app that sits, it's an iPhone only app. It sits on your iPhone. You can point your camera at things. You can download that for free now. The AI bit is it's using artificial intelligence to check out what it's seeing and to tell you what it's seeing. So it provides like a communications medium, and gives you a tool that enables you to use the power of the AI to discern what's happening in front of you. Now, one of the most common uses that we see is for people who are visually impaired, being told what's in front of them when they can't see. And when you look on the Seeing AI website and look at the blurb that they use to promote it, a lot of it is to do with visual impairment.
I said there's a great video that shows it off as well. Yeah,
there's a really cool video about it. Actually, it really demonstrates the point of what they're trying to do. But I think equally, as David said, it's trying to give other information, other sensory information, other environmental information that people may be missing. And you can see that the picture shows that somebody's happy or surprised, just giving that extra information. Now, this is something you can actually download and use for free now. It's not foolproof by any means at all, but it's a really interesting direction that technology is taking us as an app. And then I think the point about connecting to wearables, which I think was maybe not quite so clear, David, was that's, this is the type of app that may be built into a pair of glasses. So you're wearing a pair of glasses, which has something like Seeing AI's capabilities. We had a lot about Google Glass some years ago. That's fallen a little bit sort of out of favor. They haven't stopped it, but it's not been so well developed recently. But that's the stuff we're starting to see come together, isn't it? It's the sort of the apps like Seeing AI being presented, the information being presented to somebody through a pair of glasses, and they're getting that information, privately, in a sense, delivered to them to enable them to sort of consider what's going on around them in a slightly different way. That's the point you're making there, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, and so for example, one of the things that's happening with Google Glass is that it seems to have fallen off the wagon in terms of mainstream global release. But I say a lot of the research that's been doing with that technology at the moment, I said, is to do with autism. So, for example, I believe, I'll check my notes at the end, but there is a special research group at Harvard who are just taking the technology that informed Google Glass and just putting loads of effort into seeing what specific use it could be applied for autism. And like I said, I think that happens quite a lot, that this technology is kind of brought out and it has a really kind of wide application, and then it's just finding that specific way that it can be used.
Yeah, I've got another question here actually. Does autism have any impact that you know of about how people interact with chatbots? You were talking about the Uncanny Valley.
Oh, that's also a very good question. So something that I drafted out of these slides. So when I briefly talked about animojis, a potential secondary version of that was going to be things like Cortana and kind of things like that, where there seems to be a big drive for conversational interfaces. Now, if we're talking about a condition that has a kind of scope in terms of social anxiety, in terms of communication or language difficulties, then absolutely something that needs to be considered is how you are developing things that talk to you. So, for example, a Microsoft Windows machine no longer kind of says, no longer says you have turned your PC on. It will now say, hello, hi, my name's Cortana. And that's this paradigm shift that, yeah, frankly, isn't massively amenable to people with autism. So if you kind of are investing in this technology, it's ensuring that you have alternatives more than anything. So, for example, it will be saying, hey, you have this chatbot here, which you can talk to, or there is this email address if you want to just get straight to a human being and bypass all this information, for example.
Right. Cool, thank you. Somebody also pointed out, and I think I did mention there are limitations to seeing AI. When we saw Robin Christopherson do some demos of it recently, and the lighting conditions have a huge impact on what it can actually tell you about what's going on around you. We saw Robin struggling with a shiny label that he was trying to get it to read in an indoor space. And so for those that aren't familiar with that sort of stuff, it looks a bit like magic when you first see it, but it's got all sorts of holes in the actual implementation. We're right on the cusp of that stuff, I think, coming into the mainstream, aren't we, and being reliable. The same as Alexa and Google Home and all the robots we're talking to in the house. They're still slightly temperamental, to say the least. So
yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So the one thing I said, finishing off from, say, kind of self-interest behaviors. So anything that's made from an app to a wearable needs to be something that is durable. But another big point is talking about politics. So there is a lot of politics in the autism community, be it to do with terminology. For example, the shift from autism and Asperger's syndrome being separate things to it being one umbrella, to do with, say, medical diagnoses. There are a lot of kind of internal conversations being had. And one thing that often doesn't seem to be talked about when we talk about apps or to do with wearables is perhaps not considering what that is saying. So, for example, an image I have on the screen is a man who has this camera strapped to his head, and it's a very obvious camera. Now, I found this image by searching for hidden spy camera. So apparently this is supposed to be a piece of hidden technology that's very subtle, such that you can spy on conversations and record conversations without anyone knowing that you're doing it. The problem being that it's a really obvious camera that anyone could see. And the point of presenting this is that a lot of this technology, so in as much as Mark was saying, a lot of it is quite rudimentary. If you're trying to sell someone this item, either kind of in terms of literally trying to sell them a product, but also if you're trying to say, hey, I think this would really help you out, if it's something that is obvious and is something that other people perceive, then you are asking them to single themselves out. You are asking them to make a statement about themselves. So, for example, if we talk about a condition is to do with social anxiety, then perhaps not the best thing in the world to say, hey, please strap something onto your face so that everyone knows the condition that you have. Now, this isn't an unknown point with assistive technology. So, for example, it can be high-tech or low-tech. One can be, so for example, the symbol cane. So, for example, in the kind of world of vision impairment, there is a thing called the symbol cane, which isn't a cane that is literally used for navigating the world, but is a way of saying, hey, I have a vision impairment, perhaps give me more space, or this is why I might not be, running up and down the stairs. But it's trying to make an outward statement to people. And it's the thing of saying, if you want to get people on board with that, then it's needing to talk to the community. It's getting people in with autism, it's user testing with people with autism, and ensuring that you have that conversation with the community, such that things are designed in such a way that they are happy to adopt them and it's not forced upon anyone.
Great, thank you. So that's absolutely fantastic, David. And we're going to just summarise with a few points here, but just to let you know, there's a few questions that have come in. And before I jump onto this, I'm just going to ask a question about the community that you refer to. Somebody said, what do you mean by the community? Is there a specific place where you would tend to go and engage with people? Is it very fragmented? What's the nature of that thing you're describing as a community?
So at the moment, so the biggest that I've ever been a part of is websites like Wrong Planet, for example. The nomenclature being the idea of I have autism and I assume to have been born on the wrong planet. To say it's a huge forum that's specifically for people with autism. I said that's the big one I know of at the moment. A lot of people used to be on BBC Ouch, but I think people are currently kind of moving away from that a little bit. So yeah, Wrong Planet is the big one at the moment. Okay,
thank you. So I'm just going to summarise a little bit. We've talked about the basics of autism, and considered some of the symptoms and stats for those people who are familiar with it. A lot of you were already, then you would recognise that. I think it's interesting that you looked at the accessibility concerns, and that threw up, of course, that the benchmarks are there already in the case of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those guidelines are quite technical and quite specific, and they apply to websites and apps, for example. So they're a way of understanding how you need to design things better, because they throw up the obstacles that you need to consider that some people may face when using your website or your app. I like the stuff about the future accessibility tech, because I think we're on the cusp with that. We've done quite a lot of work around AI, and actually you first delivered this, David, of course, at TechShare Pro in November, when we looked specifically at artificial intelligence and accessibility and disability issues. And we know that we're on the cusp of a new sort of age of technology, with AI delivering lots of benefits to lots of disabled people. And I think you had a couple of great examples there of how that's going to work. And of course, we know that tech can help with treatment as well as just dealing with day-to-day life. But do remember that the bleeding edge may not necessarily be autism friendly. I think a lot of what you're throwing up is just a sensitivity and a question at any given stage about any of the designs that you're working on. You know, how would this look or feel, or be experienced by somebody with autism? What would be the questions that we need to ask ourselves as we're developing it? We could use some of the tools that we have to promote more fruitful dialogue. There's some of the ways that we will be able to use, or we already use, as you mentioned, forums, for example. Online forums have always been a place where all sorts of people with lots of different disabilities and impairments have found it safe to connect and collect their community together. So that's those sorts of virtual communities and the tools within them are hugely valuable. And then, you know, it needs to be considering what's robust and what can be accepted by the, as you called it, ASPI community here. I'll get you to talk about that more in a second, because we need to be careful that we are considering the needs of people with lots of different experiences of what we're doing. So, and then you've made these two final points when we were discussing, sort of summing up, that the tech discussed needs to help people with autism be more normal. I'd quite like you to talk to that, and also the stuff about not mentioning stuff that helps neurotypical people understand autism. Could you just summarize quickly for us about those 2 points, and then we'll move on to some questions.
Yes, of course. So one thing to say just on the conversation about the autism community. So if you are interested in finding it, then terms like ASPI are the things to look out for. So that's the kind of term that is kind of used internally for the people with autism. Is they would introduce themselves as being an ASPI. In terms of those 2 final points, so something that I really want to kind of stress before kind of handing off with this stuff is that what I've talked about is assistive technology, but it's assistive technology that helps people with autism to communicate to people that don't have autism. And what I sort of haven't been able to cover today is more things to do with technology that actually helps people that don't have autism interact with people that do. The case, for example, being with stuff like Seeing AI, it's the use of it is, or the use case for that kind of stuff is for, say, someone with autism to understand the emotions of someone they're talking to, as opposed to there being some kind of universal solution where similarly someone who didn't have autism, so someone who I would describe as neurotypical, would be able to communicate with someone with autism and have that same level of information. So being able to use technology in such a way as to, you know, for example, discern my facial expressions, or perhaps kind of mine my kind of conversation for information. So, for example, people with autism often speak with, say, a very monotone tone of voice, or don't have a very kind of strong inflection in their voice, such that that is something that perhaps technology could mine, such as to communicate to, say, someone who's neurotypical, saying, this is how this person with autism is currently feeling.
Great, that's really helpful summing up. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of interesting questions here, and we can move on to the questions now. If you want to change the slide, then we'll what I've got, the first one is, I think this is almost like a generic point, because I think you obviously covered lots of ground in terms of the sorts of testing and assumptions that you're making when you're doing your work as a sort of an accessibility consultant. But considering that autism is uniquely individual and difficult to cater to all needs, how much can you actually specify detailed advice? I mean, to what extent can you make recommendations which you know are going to work for everybody, and to what, and then on the other hand, how much does that mean that you may not be able to meet the needs of every person using a particular solution? So how do you balance those two things out in sort of day-to-day work?
Yeah, so that again is a great question coming in. The quote that I might misquote is something along the lines of, if you have met one person with autism, you have met one person with autism. You haven't met the dictionary definition of autism, because that doesn't exist. It is a multivariable condition that kind of affects this kind of huge Venn diagram with so many overlapping points. Again, the thing I would say with that comes back to things like use testing and talking to the community, and not just talking to one person. So don't just kind of take my word for some of these things. Get out there and try and talk to a lot of people. I think with some of these things, it's about ensuring a baseline. So, for example, some of the web content accessibility guidelines I talked about, in terms of, say, not having audio that automatically plays, not having carousels that automatically move, not having anything that happens unexpectedly on input, having careful consideration of your colors. Again, these are somewhat universal things that, say, aren't just important for autism, but just more generally in terms of usability, inclusive design. And I would say, so if you can kind of make sure you make those baseline checks or solutions in place, and then it's more about the kind of the long tail solution of getting a lot of people involved in user testing to make sure that you are casting your net necessarily wide, as because it is a spectrum disorder.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's a couple of people who made this point, but Dinah's made it very well, that as well as watching videos of doing things, I mean, just having someone share the experience with you who really does get the emotional impact of using your service, that could be hugely helpful for anybody designing services. And that's a classic reflection, really, of putting the user at the center of the design process, isn't it? Having someone that you sit with and watch them use and reflect back to you about how they feel about using your service is often the moment of most stunning insight that you're going to get, quite apart from all the other tests you can run. And there's not much that can reproduce that. That doesn't necessarily mean you're catering for everybody, but immediately going to throw up concerns that you will be able to see that you may not have realised. So one more point. Someone's got a question about video instruction material. Is this useful for autistic people to function in the workplace? And that actually made me think of something else. I know that the BBC is using VR to allow people within its inclusive recruitment processes, people with autism and other related, I mean, anybody, I think, but particularly then thinking about people with autism, to walk around the workspaces that they're going to be considering working in. So they're using virtual reality to enable people to see the spaces before they become part of it. The same thing with video instructions. Presumably that's a really helpful way of enhancing the information about your service so that people can experience it before they actually need to connect in physically.
Oh, absolutely. So this is perhaps slightly informal, but so I can talk somewhat of my personal experiences. Whenever I've been anywhere, I have to scope it out on Google Maps, and I have to kind of walk up and down the streets with Google Maps, say, okay, that's where it is, that's the side of the street it's on, here's the surrounding area, things like that.
Yeah, cool. So great. Well, firstly, to say a huge thank you to you, David. I've obviously sort of seen what you've done before in the sense of the previous time you've talked this through. Every time we go through it, we learn more, and it's fantastic insight, both in terms of your technical knowledge and your own personal experience. There's some great advice and information that's been dropped into the questions box for us, and we'll be summing that up when we share the information, useful forums and other places where you can get more help if you're looking for it. David's pulled up a very long list of references that he used in producing his material, which we will share. It's all part of the notes here in terms of the slides, so you can see those straight away on SlideShare if there's anything that you wanted to follow up that we mentioned that you wanted to know more about. We'll be recording the webinar and sharing that afterwards in a captioned format with all of this, the notes built in. So thank you again for joining us. We had almost 100 people on board today, so that's great. And please do let us know if you've got any questions. When we share the notes and information as post-event, please do let us know if there's anything else you want to know about. And thank you again, David, and thank you all for joining us.
No, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming.